The Hog's Head had a way of making every ambition look slightly obscene. That was not, Severus Snape thought as he mounted the narrow stairs, because ambition itself was ugly. It was because the place took all the fragile things men preferred to wrap in velvet: hope, hunger, fear, need, and soaked them in old beer, stale smoke, and the ammoniac bite of goats until no one could pretend nobility for very long. Beneath him, the common room muttered in low, suspicious voices. Someone laughed without warmth. Rain rattled against the leaded windows in hard little bursts, a February rain blown sharp by wind from the hills, and the smell rising through the floorboards was thick enough to taste. He moved with care. He had always moved with care. Care had been bred into him by the narrow rooms of Spinner's End, by a father whose temper traveled faster than footsteps, by a mother whose silences were as dangerous as argument, by school corridors where the clever survived less by brilliance than by timing. At 20, he was lean to the point of gauntness, all angles and pallor and black cloth, but there was nothing frail in him. He had come too far to be dismissed as a skulking boy in borrowed robes. He had served too usefully, learned too much, and turned his mind too profitably to darker and more intricate forms of magic for that. The door at the landing ahead stood not quite closed. Light touched the crack in a narrow golden seam. Severus paused. He knew, from inquiries conducted in tones polite enough to be forgettable, that Albus Dumbledore had agreed to interview Sybil Trelawney there. It was absurd, on the face of it. Sybil was a fluttering, impractical creature with more shawls than sense, a woman whose chief gift seemed to be the ability to convince gullible people that sherry and self-dramatization counted as mysticism. Yet Dumbledore had come in person, and Dumbledore did nothing in person without reason. Severus angled himself beside the jamb, his breath shallow, his wand hidden up his sleeve. Inside, Dumbledore sat in the one decent chair the room possessed, long fingers laced over the head of a carved walking stick he had no need to lean on. He looked old and mild and a little foolish if one wished to die underestimating him. His half-moon spectacles caught the candlelight. The candle, placed in a chipped saucer at the center of the table, cast the room in a low and intimate glow that made the torn wallpaper and sagging bed look almost ceremonial. Across from him sat Sybil Trelawney, all magnified eyes, bracelets, and thinning velvet. She had been speaking in the soft, drifting voice she used for cultivated strangeness. "I'm afraid," Dumbledore was saying with that infuriating courtesy of his, "that while your great-great-grandmother's reputation was considerable, I have found your own interview somewhat less—" He did not finish. Sybil shuddered. It was not theatrical. Severus had seen theatrics all his life, from schoolboys posturing before one another to self-proclaimed adepts invoking powers they could not channel. This was something else. Her head dropped back. The candle flame flattened. For one impossible second, the room seemed to brace itself. When she spoke again, the voice that came from her mouth was harsh, cold, and utterly unlike her own. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Severus did not feel the stairs beneath his feet. The words struck the air like iron. "Born as the 7th month dies, to those who have defied him thrice. The Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will bear a power the Dark Lord knows not. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." Sybil convulsed once, as if the sound itself had passed through her like a blade. Then she sagged. The candle sprang upright. The room was suddenly only a room again, shabby and dim and smelling of damp plaster. Dumbledore had not moved much. That, more than anything, chilled Severus. Only the knuckles around his walking stick had tightened, whitening through the old skin. He leaned forward, his face transformed not by fear but by attention sharpened to a lethal point. "My dear Professor Trelawney," he said gently, "would you oblige me by repeating what you have just said?" Sybil blinked. Her pupils wandered. "Said," she murmured. "I said I am dreadfully thirsty." Severus did not wait to hear more. He backed from the door, pulse hammering in his throat. One with the power, born as the 7th month dies, defied him thrice. There were names already moving through his mind, names and dates and members of the Order of the Phoenix, who had made a habit of getting in the way of men better suited to rule. He had not the full shape yet, but he had enough. Enough to be valuable. Enough to matter. A hand like a meat hook seized the back of his collar and slammed him against the wall so hard his teeth clicked together. Aberforth Dumbledore smelled of wool, livestock, and a temper only partially civilized by age. "Listening at doors, are you?" he snarled. Severus twisted, already reaching for his wand, but Aberforth was quicker than a man his size had any right to be. The landing jolted beneath them. A curse cracked past Severus's ear and burst the banister in a spray of splinters. He ducked, shoved hard with his shoulder, and half fell, half slid down 3 stairs at once. "Get out!" Aberforth roared after him. The common room looked up in a ragged turn of heads. Severus kept moving. Cold air slapped him the moment he hit the street. Rain had turned to sleet. Thin stinging needles that slicked the cobbles and silvered the roofs of Hogsmeade in a hard sheen. Behind him the tavern door banged open, but no one followed. He drew his cloak close and ran. By the time he reached the edge of the village, his breath hurt, though whether from exertion or exultation he could not have said. The dark rose up around him in black pines and soaked earth. Far off, the castle loomed against the sky, its lit windows golden in the storm. But he did not look toward it for long. Hogwarts had once been the measure of his world. It was not now. He apparated from the shelter of a stone wall, vanishing with a crack that the wind tore apart. He landed in the yew-walk behind a manor house that had stood since before the Tudors and already looked older than weather. The gravel was black with rain. No light showed at the front, but the windows along the western wing burned low and red behind thick glass. 2 masked figures stood like statues beneath the archway. Neither challenged him. His mark had seen to that. The room into which he was admitted had a ceiling so high the fire never quite warmed it. Shadows climbed the paneling in long vertical bars. A globe of blown green glass hung from chains above the table, coloring the air beneath it with a sickly, underwater cast. Men and women stood along the walls in dark traveling cloaks, or sat in carved chairs with the posture of predators at ease. Lucius Malfoy's silver-blonde hair was a pale slash in the gloom. Bellatrix Lestrange lounged beside the hearth, boot braced against the andiron, eyes bright with the dangerous, almost childish avidity of a born fanatic. No one spoke above a murmur. At the far end of the table stood the only man in the room who had no need of a mask. Tom Riddle had once been a name spoken in school corridors with admiration. Years of darker magic had not made him monstrous to the eye. That would have been simpler. He remained arrestingly, unnaturally handsome. His face all fine bones and bloodless skin. His black hair pushed carelessly back from a brow that gave him the severe beauty of old portraiture. But there was something ruined in the elegance, something cold and stripped and avid. His eyes, when they lifted to Severus, were not red but so dark they swallowed the light. "You were followed?" he asked. "No, my lord." "You were heard?" "I do not think so. Aberforth Dumbledore found me outside the door after I had heard enough to know it mattered." A small silence went through the room. Bellatrix grinned. Lucius did not alter expression by so much as a blink. Tom only watched Severus for a moment, as if measuring the exact distance between usefulness and disappointment. "Then tell me," he said. Severus did. He repeated each word as nearly as memory allowed, the cadence still stamped hot on his mind. "Born as the 7th month dies. Defied him thrice. Mark him as his equal. Power the Dark Lord knows not. Neither can live while the other survives." When he was finished, the fire cracked in the grate with a sound like bone. Tom's fingers rested lightly on the table edge. He did not seem at first to react at all. Then he smiled, and the expression was so slight that only those nearest would have seen it. But it changed the room like the drop in air before lightning. "A prophecy," he said softly. and spoken to Dumbledore. No one moved. "How many children," he continued, "have been born at the end of July to those who have defied me 3 times?" Lucius answered, "Not many, my lord. The Order's most active members are known to us. We can make inquiries." "We already are making inquiries," Bellatrix said, almost purring. "Say the word and I will bring you every cradle in Britain." Tom did not look at her. "You mistake slaughter for precision, Bellatrix." She lowered her eyes at once, though the smile remained. Severus felt the cold seep through his wet boots into the bones of his feet. Precision. That was the word that mattered. Not because Tom was merciful. Mercy had nothing to do with it. Precision belonged to men who understood consequence. Men who did not gamble because they considered themselves beyond loss. Tom turned back to Severus. "You have done well," he said. The praise fell like a coin into deep water. Severus bowed his head, though the skin between his shoulders prickled. He had expected reward, perhaps advancement, perhaps the public approval that made lesser men glow for weeks. Instead, he found himself looking up into a face gone utterly still. And what he saw there was not triumph, but calculation stripped to its frame. For the first time that night, Severus understood that whatever else the prophecy meant, it had been received not by an immortal terror out of legend, but by a man who knew enough of mortality to take warning. By dawn, the prophecy had been reduced to ink, lineage, and blood. There was always an hour in any campaign when fear had to become paperwork. Tom believed in that with almost religious severity. Passion inspired men to kill. Records allowed them to rule. The rain had gone on all night. It hissed against the tall windows and slid in silver chains down the panes, while servants who would later remember nothing at all refreshed the candles, the tea, the mulled wine, and the parchment on which half the future of Britain seemed to rest. The table was strewn with ministry directories, family registers, surveillance notes taken by hands too dull to grasp what they had recorded, and the finer private ledgers that old families kept hidden even from the law. The black genealogies were there, and the Prewitts, the Boneses, the Longbottoms, the Potters. Names linked to names in black and green ink. Births, marriages, schoolhouses, political sympathies, holdings, inheritances, grudges. Tom stood over them all like a scholar of catastrophe. "The child must be born at the end of July," he said. His voice never needed force. It traveled cleanly through a room and settled where he wanted it, in the nerve rather than the ear. "Born to those who have defied me 3 times. Dumbledore's order makes a habit of theatrical resistance, but most of them do not survive long enough to count to 3. Lucius, gloved hands resting on the back of his chair, inclined his head. "There are 2 likely candidates." Tom did not tell him to continue. Lucius knew better than to require permission for usefulness. "Frank and Alice Longbottom have a son born on the 30th of July. Aurors, both active, both troublesome. The other is Harry Potter, born the 31st, son of James Potter and Lily Potter. Potter has obstructed several of our operations personally. His wife is connected." None. Severus felt something inside him go cold, and then colder still. He had known in the abstract that the pool of names would narrow quickly. He had known Lily and James had a child. He had known the dates. Yet knowledge held at a distance was one thing. Hearing her named in that room, under that voice, was something else entirely. Bellatrix laughed softly. "Then kill both." Tom glanced at her with a trace of boredom, and announced to all of Dumbledore's followers that I tremble before cradle songs. "No." His finger drifted over the parchment as if not touching it. "The Longbottoms are pure blood," he said. "Well connected. Conventional. Brave in the stupid, dutiful way of policemen. Their son would be reared in certainty, in the complacent confidence of old names and approved ideals. The Potters are less tidy. James Potter is pure blood by birth and reckless by nature. Lily Potter was born a Muggle. Their son crosses 2 worlds. He is like to be raised with contradictions. Such children learn to make power of fracture. No, no. There was a murmur around the table. Bellatrix's lip curled at Lily's blood. Lucius's expression remained unreadable. Severus kept his face blank by force. Tom's eyes lifted. "And there is this," he said, though now he sounded almost conversational. "Prophecy has a taste for symmetry. If some future enemy is to be imagined for me, why would fate choose a boy bred from the certainties I have already mastered? Better a child marked by the same division the world once expected to master me." No one answered. No one could. It was one of the things that drew his followers and damned them, the moments when his thinking seemed to elevate itself into inevitability, as if history were simply another instrument he had learned to play. Severus watched him and saw beneath the composure a fact few in that room would ever understand. Tom did not dismiss the prophecy because he was fearless. He studied it because he was not. He did not fear like lesser men feared. He did not jolt at shadows or start at a raised voice. But he despised contingency. He despised any unmeasured chance that might one day put his life into another person's hand. That hatred had made him patient where others mistook him for impulsive. It had made him build influence in the Wiesengamot before he openly took to murder. It had made him recruit heirs and bureaucrats, curse-breakers and clerks, not only fanatics, because nations were not conquered by terror alone, but by files misplaced, laws softened, witnesses discredited, coin directed. He did not want merely to survive. He wanted to arrange the world so that no one else could plausibly threaten his survival. The prophecy offended that design. He dismissed them near noon. Not all of them. Lucius remained, and Bellatrix, and several of the oldest inner circle. Severus lingered in the corridor outside the library, pulse high and sick and impossible to quiet. He should have left. He knew that. He was not a child any longer, and children were the ones who mistook love for immunity. Yet Lily's name beat in his head like a second heart. He waited until Lucius emerged, silk soft in his polished boots, until Bellatrix drifted away smiling to herself, until the house fell into that strange, concentrated quiet of rich houses where danger lived in the walls, and no servant ever clattered. Then he knocked once, and entered without waiting to be called twice. Tom was alone. He stood with one hand braced against the mantel, looking not at the room but into the fire. In the gold and red light, his face might have belonged to a king from some colder, crueler century. "My lord." Tom did not turn immediately. "You have more." Severus's mouth was dry. "A request." That brought the dark eyes to him at last. Not surprise. Never surprise. Only interest sharpened by the fact that requests were currency, and therefore revealing. "A request," Tom repeated. Severus heard how it sounded, heard the weakness already alive in it. But there was no dignified way to speak the thing he had come to say. "If it is the Potter boy you choose," he said, forcing each word past the constriction in his throat, "I ask only that Lily Potter be spared." There was silence. The fire shifted. A log collapsed inward with a hush of sparks. Tom looked at him for so long that the room itself seemed to lean and wait. "When did you cease to call her Lily Evans?" he asked mildly. Severus could not answer. "A schoolboy infatuation, then," Tom said. "Or not so boyish as that. You have disappointed me in smaller matters. The humiliation of it should have burned. It did not." There was no room left in Severus for anything but dread. "She has no power against you," he said. "She need not die." Need. Tom let the word fall from his tongue as if examining its shape. "You speak as though death were an accounting error. If I kill her husband and her child, why should she live?" "Because I ask it." There it was. Naked, foolish, irrecoverable. Tom's expression did not alter, but something in the room sharpened dangerously. "You ask much for a woman who never wanted you." The cruelty was exact, because it was effortless. Severus felt it land and keep going. He lowered his eyes before he could reveal too much. At length Tom said, "If she stands aside, I shall not waste the curse on her." There, does that ease you? It should not have. It did, horribly, because hope, once driven low enough, would kneel before scraps. My lord. Do not mistake me, Tom said, and now his voice held the first edge of true contempt. I grant you this because your usefulness exceeds your weakness by a measurable margin, not because her life signifies anything. Severus bowed. The motion felt like breaking. When he left the library, he did not take the main drive. He went through the service gardens choked with winter thorn, over the outer wall where ice had glazed the stone, and into the bare stand of beeches beyond. There he bent forward with his hands against his knees and retched into the frozen leaves until there was nothing left in him but bile and rainwater. He had gone to a monster and begged. Worse, he had not begged for them all. The knowledge stood inside him like a spike. By evening he was on the road to Hogwarts. The cold had cleared the sky. Stars lay over the grounds like powdered glass. The castle shone above the black lake, remote and self-contained, its towers seeming to grow out of the rock rather than rest upon it. He crossed the grounds with mud drying on his hem and guilt traveling faster than thought. Minerva McGonagall passed him on the lower corridor and gave him one crisp, suspicious look that he could not have borne a month earlier. Tonight he would have walked through an inquisitorial squad without pausing. Dumbledore met him not in his office, but on the dark edge of the grounds near the old boundary stones, as if he had expected him and had chosen a place where the stars could witness the exchange. "You asked to see me urgently?" Dumbledore said. The night wind moved his beard like pale smoke. His face, in moonlight, was less grandfatherly than the school saw by day. Age stripped of comfort could look very much like authority. Severus tried, for one fatal instant, to preserve himself. "It concerns a message I heard only in part." "Spare me," Dumbledore said. 2 words. Very soft. Far more terrible than a shout. Severus looked up. Blue eyes met his with a steadiness that made lies childish. "You carried what you heard to him," Dumbledore said. "You would not be here now if the consequence did not horrify even you." The last frail structure of self-justification collapsed. "He means to kill them," Severus said. "The child, the parents. Hide them, hide her, hide them all." Dumbledore's face changed, not by much, but enough. "Her," he said. The words struck like judgment. Severus heard in it every meanness Dumbledore had already inferred, and everyone still to come. He heard the cowardice in begging for a mother while accepting the death of her husband and son as collateral. He heard himself as the sort of man he had sworn in youth he would never become. "You disgust me," Dumbledore said quietly. Severus took that without protest because he had earned it. Then Dumbledore drew a breath and turned his gaze toward the dark, sleeping castle. "But if there is still enough of a conscience in you to feel disgust for yourself, it may yet be used." Used. The word ought to have offended. Instead it steadied him. "What do you require?" "Everything," Dumbledore said. The Potter house was too small for war, and too warm for secrecy. That was Lily's first thought each time another member of the Order was smuggled through its back door under disillusionment or cloak or midnight rain. The cottage stood in a lane outside Godric's Hollow and could not by any ordinary standard be called grand. Its front windows were square and plain. The kitchen floor sloped a little where one corner of the foundation had long ago settled. The stairs complained no matter how lightly one climbed them. Yet its rooms held warmth with a kind of stubborn generosity. Bread smelled like bread there. Tea smelled like leaves, and comfort rather than necessity. When James laughed, as he still somehow managed to do, the rafters seemed to accept the sound and keep it. Harry was asleep upstairs when Sirius arrived, all black curls and rain and restless energy, bringing with him the weather and the latest rumors from London. He shook himself like a dog in the doorway, while James clapped him on the shoulder and demanded to know whether he intended to drown on the mat. Remus came later, damp to the knees and carrying the exhaustion of a man who had traveled by methods cheaper and rougher than comfort allowed. Peter arrived last. Lily noticed because Peter was the sort of person who rarely entered a room without first noticing how much space was left in it for him. They crowded around the kitchen table with mugs in hand and cloaks steaming by the stove. The curtains were drawn. James had laid his wand on the table where he could reach it without making a ceremony of vigilance. They were all too young to look as tired as they did. "Well," James said. Sirius braced both hands on the table. "Well, everyone's terrified, which would be heartening if terror made people competent." Lily shot him a look. "Specifics. Specifics are that Dumbledore thinks someone heard more at the Hog's Head than he ought to have done, and now half the Order is being told to change routes, change habits, and stop assuming the Ministry walls are soundproof." "Someone?" Remus said. "He doesn't know who?" Sirius' mouth twisted. "He has his suspicions. He did not say Severus' name. No one at the table needed him to." James leaned back, the chair creaking under the shift of his weight. "So Snivelus carries tales to his master. There's a surprise fit to stagger history." "James," Lily said. "What? If we're going to die because of the slimy little—" "You are not going to die tonight," Lily said with the deliberate calm of someone placing plates on a shelf she knew was shaky. "So stop talking as if you've decided to." Her hair was tied back in a loose knot that had partly come down over the evening, and one strand had escaped to lie against her cheek. James reached without thinking and tucked it behind her ear. He still had that with him, that unstudied movement toward her, as natural as breath. In the first years after school, it had annoyed Sirius beyond endurance, not because he begrudged them happiness, but because youth cannot bear evidence that other people have found a center it lacks. Now even Sirius only rolled his eyes out of habit. Remus cupped his mug in both hands. There were hollows beneath his cheekbones. The lamplight did not soften. If Severus heard enough to matter, then the question isn't whether Voldemort knows something. The question is what he thinks he knows. "No." Peter flinched at the name. Lily saw it. So did Sirius. The glance they exchanged was so slight another person might have missed it. James saw it too, but James had loved his friends for too long not to instinctively protect them from one another's scrutiny. "What he knows is that we're getting under his skin," James said. "Good. About time he got the sensation." Sirius barked a laugh. "That's the spirit." It was, Lily thought with sudden, aching tenderness, very like James to treat mortal danger as if it were a poor loser in a school rivalry. That brave recklessness had drawn people to him all his life. It had also convinced too many people that he did not know fear. He knew it. He merely refused to give it dignity in public. "Dumbledore wants us under tighter protection," Remus said. He spoke to Frank and Alice as well. At that, Lily's fingers tightened around her cup. "How are they?" "Tired," Remus said. "Still standing, same as the rest of us." "Did he say why?" Peter asked. No one answered at once. The kitchen clock ticked. Upstairs, a board creaked in the nursery and then settled again. Sirius spoke at last. "He thinks the danger is specific." "Specific how?" James said. Sirius shrugged in a manner too casual to be casual. "You don't know Dumbledore. He'll tell you the world is ending and still leave you to infer the weather. Something about children born at the end of July, parents who have crossed paths with Voldemort too often." James blinked. Then he laughed, once with abrupt disbelief. "You're joking." No one laughed with him. Lily set down her cup very carefully. Harry had been born on the last day of July with a cry so indignant the healer had started laughing before she could stop herself. Frank and Alice Longbottoms' boy had come a day earlier. There were two of them. 2 children. 2 families. All at once the room seemed to narrow around that fact until there was hardly enough air for the grown people inside it. "No," Sirius said. "I'm not joking." James' face changed. Not into panic. James Potter would have looked ridiculous in panic. All that height and careless grace and untamable hair collapsing into lesser motions. But the ease drained out of him in one visible tide. He looked toward the ceiling as if the nursery floor had become transparent, and he could see through it to the cot above. Lily had not understood, until that second, how much of motherhood was terror learning new names. She had feared Harry's first fever, first fall, first night he coughed in his sleep with the wet hitch that made her sit bolt upright. Those had been simple fears, almost tender in their ordinariness. This was not ordinary. This was the world stretching one cold finger toward the room where her son slept. "We'll move," James said at once. "Tonight if we have to." "You can't outrun him forever," Remus said. "Then we'll stop running later. Tonight we move." Lily rose without noticing she had done so. Dumbledore said tighter protection. What protection? Sirius met her eyes. The Fidelius. The word landed with the weight of irreversible things. Even in wartime it was not spoken lightly. The Fidelius charm did not merely hide a place. It took a secret and folded it into a living soul, turning location into trust, geography into vulnerability, the map of one's life into something another person physically carried. If cast properly, it could confound armies. If betrayed, it could end a family in minutes. James was already pacing, one hand shoved through his hair. "All right, fine, good, we'll do that." Peter's face had gone colorless. "Tonight?" "As soon as possible," Sirius said. Dumbledore offered himself. James stopped. "No. Day." All of them looked at him. "James?" Lily said carefully. "No." He shook his head once, decisive as a snapped wand. "No offense to Dumbledore, but if Voldemort thinks Dumbledore's our secret keeper, the entire point is blown. He'll watch Dumbledore. He'll watch every move he makes. It has to be someone else. Duh. Key. Kamal. Someone no one would suspect," Sirius said, and there was a dangerous light in his eyes now. The exhilaration he always felt when strategy became personal. Someone close enough to know, but not important enough to draw notice. Remus looked down into his tea. Lily saw the motion and understood the wound before it was named. In war, suspicion followed poverty and illness, as naturally as rain followed clouds. Remus's absences were unavoidable. His secrecy, inherited. His loyalties, though tested and proven, were still too often measured against his condition by smaller minds. He knew they all knew that. He had grown too practiced at hiding the bruise. "Remus," she said before anyone could fill the silence with something crueler than truth, "you know we trust you." He smiled a little, and it was exactly the smile of a man who had been told variations on the same thing his entire life. "I know." Sirius took a breath to speak, then stopped. For once he seemed aware that his instinct for grand gestures had brought him to the edge of injuring someone he loved. Peter stared at his own hands. They were plump, nervous hands, the hands of a man who had always looked more suited to counting cards or wringing out dishcloths than to casting combat curses. Yet those hands had held a wand in half a dozen fights. Those hands had dragged wounded people by the shoulders out of rooms with the walls on fire. Lily knew this. She had seen it. Pity and contempt were not the same thing, and Peter had far too often been the object of the latter from people who mistook polish for courage. But something had gone wrong in him. Or did that? Not evenly. Not in ways one could rank. It cracked some people open into nobility and others into resentment, and some into terrors so private they could not bear to have them named. "We'll think," Lily said. "We don't decide tonight." "Tonight is exactly when you decide," Sirius said. "Lily, I'm sorry, but that's the whole point. There may not be another safe week to enjoy a family conference." James crossed to her and put his hands on her shoulders. "Whatever we do together." She looked at him and remembered him at 15, strutting by the lake as if the whole world were a stage built for his amusement. She remembered him at 17, blood on his sleeve after a fight he had chosen because someone weaker had been cornered. She remembered him trembling the first time he held Harry, not because infants were fragile, though they were, but because happiness that vast made a person vulnerable to every blade in existence. "Together," he said, as if together were a spell in itself. Upstairs, Harry woke and began to cry. The sound broke the tension with the blunt mercy only babies could manage. Lily went at once. James followed. By the time she had lifted Harry from his cot and tucked him against her shoulder, the room below had begun to exhale again into ordinary motion. Sirius arguing logistics, Remus counting routes, Peter offering in a rush to fetch supplies, letters, information, anything, whatever was needed. Harry's hair stuck up in soft black wisps. He smelled of milk and warm sleep and the absolute selfishness of the living. He pawed at Lily's collar and settled when she spoke to him. "Nothing," she murmured into his hair, though she had ceased to believe in the word. "Nothing's touching you. Not while I breathe." No. Downstairs, the men of her generation made plans with the confidence of people who had not yet learned how many betrayals could fit inside one season. Outside, the lane held its silence. Dumbledore had always understood that secrets behave differently depending on who was asked to keep them. Some men sealed a secret because they believed in duty. Some because they believed in love. Some because they feared consequence. The trouble was that war often made those motives indistinguishable until the precise hour distinction mattered. Frank and Alice Longbottom came to Hogwarts 2 nights later under cover of a storm large enough to occupy every ministry weather report in the country. Their cloaks shed water onto the flagstones in the antechamber outside Dumbledore's office. Frank's face bore the look of a man who had gone several months on less sleep than the human body should require and discovered, to his irritation, that it kept functioning. Alice's expression was steadier, though Lily would later say there was something about Alice then that reminded her of a bowstring pulled too long under strain. Not weaker, exactly, but altered, tuned to breaking. Neville Longbottom was left for that night with his grandmother. "There are 2 boys," Frank said without preamble once the door had closed behind them. "So say it plainly. Are we both under threat, or does Dumbledore think one of them matters more than the other?" "Nay?" Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his hands steepled. Fawkes, red as a live coal on the golden perch by the window, watched all of them with the inexhaustible composure of creatures older in spirit than any wizard cared to admit. "I think," Dumbledore said, "that Voldemort will choose the boy he sees as his likeliest counterpart." Alice's mouth tightened. "And which is that?" "The child of James and Lily Potter." Frank let out one slow breath. It was not relief. Relief, in people of quality, often came wrapped in shame. "Because of blood," he said. "Because of resemblance," Dumbledore said. "Tom Riddle has always been most fascinated by mirrors." That name, used so baldly, fell strangely in the room. Most people no longer spoke it. Voldemort had become title, terror, abstraction. But Dumbledore had a habit of stripping awe from things he intended to fight. Frank rubbed his jaw. "Then the Potters take the Fidelius first." "They do," Dumbledore said. "But I would advise you not to count yourselves safe." Alice looked toward the rain-lashed window, though there was nothing visible beyond it but night and her own reflection. "We stopped being safe years ago." Severus stood in the shadow near the shelves, silent, as Dumbledore had instructed. He had not expected the Longbottoms to look so ordinary. That was a stupid thought, he knew. Heroism came wrapped in ordinary skin more often than myth admitted. Still, he had imagined something harder, more glinting. Instead, Frank Longbottom had mud on the hem of his trousers, and Alice Longbottom's left sleeve had been mended twice at the cuff with thread a shade too dark. They looked like parents with too much work and too little time. Perhaps that was heroism's oldest disguise. When the Longbottoms had gone, Dumbledore remained seated for a long moment without speaking. "You think I am wrong," Severus said at last. "I think," said Dumbledore, "that being right in these matters is another name for failing in time." The office was warm, but Severus could not ease the chill in his hands. "You said you required everything of me." "Yes." Dumbledore rose and crossed to the window. Rain traced his reflection in trembling vertical threads. "Then you will continue to serve him. You will tell me what he plans, whom he suspects, where he strikes next if you can. And you will understand that if the cost of what you have set in motion proves greater than your conscience can bear, that burden will not relieve you of it." There was no comfort in the old man. Severus had not asked for any. Yet he found himself saying, "If they die." Dumbledore turned. "If they die," he said, "it will not be because one man hated death enough to seek control over every cradle in Britain. It will not be because another loved too narrowly. It will be because a great many people, over a great many years, allowed cruelty to become policy and vanity to masquerade as destiny. Do not flatter yourself that this tragedy begins or ends with you, Severus. But do not imagine you are innocent." The words left no place to stand, except truth. Severus bowed his head. Later that same week, he stood again in the manor house where Tom measured futures like a mathematician examining proofs. The maps had changed. The Longbottoms movements were marked in blue, the Potter's suspected routes in silver, as if the war were some elaborate game played by patient men over polished wood. Bellatrix traced possibilities with one lacquered nail. Dolohov suggested an attack near St. Mungo's to stretch order resources thin. Lucius, cool and almost bored, recommended pressure on known sympathizers in the ministry to delay any emergency response. Tom listened to all of it. Then he sent them away one by one, until only Lucius remained. "You disapprove," Tom said without looking up from the parchment in his hand. Lucius smiled slightly. "Of your choosing the Potter boy? No. I only note that old families will hear of it one day, and wonder why the pure bloodline of Longbottom failed to offend prophecy as deeply as a half-blood child." Tom set down the parchment. "Old families," he said. "I have been wondering for centuries why the future declines to flatter them. Their disappointment will survive." Lucius inclined his head in acknowledgement. He had never been stupid enough to confuse blood ideology with actual intellect. He believed in advantage, inheritance, aesthetic hierarchy, and the maintenance of power by those fitted, by breeding if possible, by ruthlessness when necessary, to hold it. But he had the shrewd aristocrat's instinct for useful contradictions. If Tom preferred a half-blood enemy because the symbolism pleased him, Lucius would not challenge the symbolism. He would merely calculate how it altered alliances. "And the mother?" he asked. Tom's eyes rested on him, dark and bright and impossible to read in full. A loyal servant made a sentimental petition. "Ah." Lucius's expression did not change. "How tiresome." "Not particularly," Tom said. "Tiresome things are those which endure without offering instruction. Human attachments are very instructive." "And dangerous?" Tom smiled then, not with humor but with the faint glimmer of something almost philosophical. "To the attached, always." He left the room before Lucius could reply. There were hours, walking alone through the shuttered corridors of the manor or the Winterfields beyond it, when Tom admitted to himself what none of his followers would have understood. He was not unsettled by the prophecy because it foretold defeat. Prophecies rarely survived contact with decisive action. He was unsettled because it presumed a symmetry between him and some unseen child. The insult lay there, in the implication that the world, which had produced him by violence, contempt, abandonment, and accident, could simply produce another answer to him as if dark brilliance were a pattern, and not a singularity. Yet the prophecy had not named a child already alive and grown. It had named an infant. A possibility. Raw material. That could be solved. He stood that night in the old chapel ruins beyond the U-Walk, where only 3 walls remained, and the roof had long ago opened itself to the weather. Stars burned above the empty nave. His wand turned once between his fingers, a motion almost idle. He knew better than to despise children. Children grew. Children were shaped. The world liked to pretend that innocence was a shield, when in fact it was merely softness awaiting an impression. Strike early enough, and you did not merely defeat an enemy. You denied him formation. The choice, once made, felt clean. He would go himself. Not because he relished unnecessary risk. He did not. Not because Bellatrix would have failed, though fanaticism made blunt work of precision. Not because Lucius lacked nerve, or Dolohov lacked skill. He would go because prophecy, however ridiculous, had placed a question against his name, and he had never once in his life endured a question he could answer by force. Back at the castle, Dumbledore moved pieces of his own. Order members were rerouted. Safe houses changed. Wards were layered and tested. Messages were sent by Owl, by Patronus, by the hands of exhausted young witches and wizards who looked scarcely older than students, and in some cases were not. In one upper corridor, Minerva McGonagall caught Severus emerging from the headmaster's office at an hour when no teacher should have been abroad, and stared at him until he thought, absurdly, that she might transfigure him on instinct. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Walking," he said, her mouth compressed. "You slither, not walk." Then she swept past him. Had he been another man, he might have smiled. Instead, he went down to the dungeons and worked until dawn over brews that required his full precision, because precision was the only thing in him not cracking. Far above, the castle slept. Far south, in a village too small for history and too decent for legend, a child rolled over in his cot and dreamed with the fearless unconsciousness reserved for the very young. Autumn in hiding had a peculiar rhythm. Days were too quiet until they were suddenly frantic. One lived by small domestic noises because the large public ones had become inaccessible. The postman's tread, children shouting in lanes, shop bells, traffic, ordinary quarrels carried across garden walls. In their place came kettle hiss, fire settling, baby laughter, the scratch of a pen on paper, a wand lightly tapped against a windowsill to test whether the outer wards still held their tone. At Godric's Hollow, Lily learned every variation of those sounds. The Fidelius was not yet cast in the first week of October, but the decision sat inside the house like a fifth inhabitant. Sirius came and went. Remus visited less, not by choice, but because movement had grown dangerous for him even among allies. Peter arrived twice with bread, gossip, and a nervous eagerness to be helpful that made Lily ache for him, even as some quieter instinct watched him with unease she could not justify. James spent too much time by the front window pretending not to look through the curtain. "You're going to wear a groove in the floorboards," Lily told him one afternoon. He glanced down. "Then the floorboards ought to be grateful for the honor." She laughed despite herself. Harry, sitting between them in a fortification of cushions, seized the moment to pull himself upright by James' trouser leg and announce his triumph with a squeal so loud it startled the cat next door into yowling through the wall. James scooped him up at once, and the world, for a handful of seconds, became simple again. Harry had James' untamable black hair and Lily's eyes, though at that age his gaze still had the deep, grave quality babies wore when studying the strange size and unreliability of adults. "Look at you," James said, holding him high. "Defying gravity already. Good man." "They'll think the laws of nature are advisory," Lily said. "Then he's definitely mine." There was a knock at the back door in the sequence Sirius used. 2 sharp, 1 slow, 2 sharp. James set Harry into Lily's arms and reached for his wand in the same motion. By the time he opened the door, Sirius was already pushing inside, cheeks red from cold, black hair full of wind. "We need to settle it," he said. "Tonight." He shrugged out of his cloak. Mud spotted the floor. He did not notice. Lily tightened her hold on Harry. "Settle what?" Keeper." There it was, no gentler for bluntness. Sirius had always hated letting dread ripen. He preferred to cut into it and examine the mess. James shut the door and renewed the ward with a twist of his wand. "I thought we had." "With me," Sirius said. "Yes, which is precisely why we need to rethink it." Lily stared at him. "I beg your pardon." Sirius ran both hands through his hair, a gesture so like James that for a second the years between their first meeting and now seemed to collapse into one long, dangerous adolescence. "Listen to me. Voldemort knows we're close. Everyone knows. If there's a traitor in the Order, and don't give me that look, There is one somewhere or they wouldn't be closing in this fast. Then he'll assume it's me if anyone's guessed the Fidelius plan at all. He'll hunt me. He'll have half the country watched for my movements. That makes me the worst possible choice. Nay. James' mouth opened, then shut again. Lily shifted Harry to her other hip. And who is your better idea? Sirius looked over his shoulder as Peter, who had arrived silently enough to hear most of it from the hall, froze on the threshold with a sack of potatoes against his chest. Peter blinked. Mine. Yes, yours, Sirius said. No one would suspect you. The potatoes thudded to the floor. In the stunned pause that followed, Harry reached out toward them with interest and said something that sounded remarkably like, James started laughing first. It was not mockery. It was that helpless, disbelieving laugh of a man whose life had just lurched sideways and expects the ceiling to confirm the joke. Sirius, he said, that's mad. That, Sirius said, is exactly why it's brilliant. Peter had gone white beneath the flush already natural to his face. I'm not sure. Which is another reason, Sirius said. You don't look like a man anyone would entrust with the location of the most wanted family in Britain. No offense, Wormtail. Peter made a sound halfway between a laugh and a swallowed sob. Lily looked from one to the other and felt the room tilting into peril disguised as cleverness. No, she said. 3 male heads turned. No, she repeated. Not because I don't trust Peter. I do. But because this sounds exactly like the sort of plan boys convince themselves is foolproof 10 minutes before it kills them. James took Harry from her and bounced him once absently. Lily. No, Dot. Dumbledore offered himself. We should let him. My. Sirius' eyes flashed. And prove to Voldemort that Dumbledore's tucked you under his wing? He'd turn the country inside out. He already is, Lily snapped. James stepped between them before the old school fire and Sirius could answer hers in kind. Lily. His voice was softer now. Padfoot's right about one thing. Dumbledore's too obvious. Then Remus, she said at once. Silence answered. Remus, sitting by the hearth with his hands clasped between his knees, lifted his head. The fire gilded the scars hidden imperfectly at his temples and wrists, the thin white lines along his knuckles, the old marks of transformations barely controlled. His expression was calm enough to hurt. That won't do either, he said. Why not? He smiled a little. Because if there is a spy in the Order, I am precisely the person both sides could plausibly suspect. Which means I'll be watched from all directions. Sirius knows that. Sirius swore under his breath. James held Harry tighter. Moony. It's not an accusation, Remus said. It's arithmetic. Peter had not moved. Lily looked at him and saw, with sudden clarity, the thing that made him dangerous without making him evil. He wanted desperately to be chosen. Not trusted in the grand abstract way people said kind things to weak friends. Chosen. Given the center, just once. Asked to carry something that proved he was not merely the extra place at a table already full. And because Lily saw it, some part of her recoiled. There are forms of need that should never be handed a nation's safety, let alone a child's. But James was turning now, seeing what she had seen and interpreting it through love. Pete, he said, you'd do it, wouldn't you? Peter licked his lips. His eyes flicked from James to Sirius to the floor and back again. Of course I would, he whispered. If you wanted me to. Sirius clapped him on the shoulder with a force that nearly knocked him sideways. There, then. Lily's objection rose and died against the sight of James smiling, not carelessly, but with that particular warmth he reserved for the people he had chosen as his own. She knew better than most how hard James could be toward those outside the circle. But once someone was within it, his faith in them had a terrible beauty. He did not have trust. He trusted like a man jumping. All right, she heard herself say. She would later remember the exact shape of Peter's face then. Relief flooded with terror, gratitude tangled with something more furtive and far less clean. But memory after disaster acquires false edges. In the moment she only thought he looked as if he might faint. The spell was cast 2 nights later. Dumbledore did it himself. No speech, no preamble, no attempt to comfort them with the theater of solemnity. The enchantment moved through the cottage like a pressure change, visible only in consequences. The address that had existed in minds and maps and habits seemed to slip sideways into a deeper place. Lily felt it leave her own mouth. She could think the name of the village, the lane, the front gate, and then found she could not speak them to anyone who had not already been told by Peter. It was like reaching for a word one had known all one's life, and discovering the mind now guarded it from the tongue. When the casting was complete, Dumbledore looked at Peter for a long time. "Understand," he said, "that this trust is not merely magical." Peter swallowed. "Yes, Professor. If you betray it," Dumbledore said, "magic will be the least of what follows." Peter nodded so fast it bordered on bobbing. That night, after the others had gone, James found Lily standing in Harry's room with the curtains parted a little, and the dark glass showing only their own reflections. "You still think we made a mistake?" he said. She did not deny it. "I think war teaches clever men to adore cleverness." James came up behind her and rested his chin on her shoulder. In the glass, their faces hovered together above Harry's sleeping form. "Pete would die for us." "Would he?" she said softly. James was silent. "James," she said, and now she turned, because there were truths a marriage could not bear unless spoken face to face. "I love your faith in people, but sometimes I think you love what they were at 17 and assume the rest will catch up." His expression changed. "That's not fair." "No," she said. "It isn't. It's frightened." He touched her hair, then her cheek. "We're hidden now. That's what matters." "Me. Ew. Until it matters who holds the hiding place." He kissed her forehead with the tired patience of a husband too much in love to argue every point to victory. "Then we'll trust our friend," he said. Outside, autumn went on darkening toward winter. 3 days later, Peter Pettigrew stood in the churchyard at Little Hangleton with the dead leaves slick underfoot and waited for the Dark Lord. He had chosen the place because no one chose it anymore. The stones leaned at angles. Names had dissolved into moss and rain. The church itself watched from beyond the graves with blind windows and a tower missing part of its crown. Peter's breath smoked before him. His hands would not stop shaking. He had tried gripping his wand, stuffing both hands into his pockets, clasping them together as if in prayer. Nothing helped. He heard no approach. Tom simply existed suddenly between one headstone and the next, black cloak hanging motionless despite the wind. Peter made a noise that might have been a greeting. "You are late," Tom said. Peter had been early by 15 minutes. "I'm sorry, my lord." Tom regarded him. In moonlight, his face looked cut from a harder substance than flesh. "You have it?" Peter could not, for one nauseating second, remember how language worked. Then the secret came to his mouth and passed it, because the Fidelius did not forbid speech to the keeper. It forbade all others. He gave the address. He gave the details of the lane, the little front gate that stuck in damp weather, the habit James had of checking the upper windows before bed, the fact that Lily now carried Harry down at dawn when he woke and slept no more afterward. He gave it all. He gave even the hour at which the village would be distracted on Halloween by its tiny procession of costumed children and carved pumpkins in cottage windows. When he was finished, he realized he was crying. Tom watched the tears without any visible emotion. "You imagine," he said, "that your remorse improves the gift." Peter's mouth opened and closed. "Do not trouble me with the noises of conscience," Tom said. "You are not ennobled by feeling the knife in your own hand." He turned away. Peter, wild with the need for some assurance that would make the act survivable, blurted, "What will happen to me?" Tom looked back over one shoulder. "That depends on how well you understand silence." Then he was gone. He stood among the graves until dawn. On the afternoon of the 31st of October, Godric's hollow smelled of smoke, damp leaves, and baking. Children went up and down the lane in cloaks cut from old curtains and masks painted with crooked fangs. Someone had hung a paper bat in the grocer's window. Little orange lanterns, a Muggle custom imported and altered until it suited local taste, glowed behind pans here and there like rows of watchful eyes. Harry found the lights fascinating. He pressed both hands to the sitting room window and laughed every time a group of older children ran past shrieking with delighted menace. James stood behind him with his hands in his pockets, smiling in a way Lily knew cost him effort. "See?" he said. "Normal village. Perfectly dull. We're hidden in the safest place in Britain, and the most dangerous thing about tonight is a 6-year-old dressed as a banshee." Lily, setting plates on the table, looked over her shoulder. "Don't taunt fate. Fate cheats." He grinned at her. "That's why I taunt it. Keeps it off balance." Harry turned from the window and tottered toward James, arms raised. James scooped him up and set him on one hip. Harry was nearly 15 months old and had acquired the solemn authority of children who cannot yet form sentences but already suspect the world is incompetent. Lily carried in the stew. Outside, dusk lowered through blue into violet. Somewhere farther up the lane a dog barked, then another answered. The house had the shallow breathing stillness of evening routines. Spoon against pot, chair legs on the floorboards, the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, James making sound effects with a wooden toy broom because Harry, traitorously, loved nothing more than his father behaving like an idiot. She could almost believe in ordinary life. That was the cruelest thing about danger. It withdrew just far enough for hope to unclench. After supper, James sat on the rug with Harry and let himself be climbed. Lily cleared bowls, then leaned against the kitchen doorway to watch them while drying her hands on a towel. The lamplight turned James's hair to ink and his laughter to something richer than sound, something structural, as if the room itself were held together by that willingness to delight. "I'll get him up," she said at last. "Bath and bed?" James looked up. "Already? We've only just taught him piracy. Then he can raid again tomorrow." He handed Harry over with a mock-suffering sigh. Harry protested briefly, then became distracted by reaching for Lily's necklace. She carried him upstairs, feeling the warm, sturdy weight of him settle against her chest, and in the nursery she undressed him piece by piece while he kicked and wriggled and objected to the tyranny of sleeves. His pajamas smelled of lavender. His hair, after the bath, curled damply over his forehead in a black, unruly comma. Downstairs, James was still moving around. She heard the cupboard door, the clink of glasses, heard him humming under his breath, heard, too, the outer wards shift. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound, the sudden sensation that the house had forgotten how to keep one note within its own bones. Lily went cold from scalp to heel. "James," she called. He answered at once. "What? What?" Then there was another sound, the front door opening with no knock at all. James shouted, "Lily, take Harry and go! It's him! Go! Run! I'll hold him off!" But James' wand was downstairs. Lily knew that before she knew anything else, because James, in the false ease of family supper, had left it on the sitting room table. She knew it with the cruel clarity of a wife who has noticed 100 small habits and loved them all. She snatched Harry up so fast he cried out in surprise and ran to the nursery door just as the first cracked below. There was a crash, a man's body hitting furniture. Then James's voice, furious and alive, saying something she could not make out because the second curse came immediately after, green light bursting under the stair like swamp fire through a crack. The sound James made at the end of his life was not grand. It was cut short. Lily locked the nursery door with her wand, then with a second charm, then with a third. Her hands did not shake. That came later. For the moment there was only speed and the hard narrowing of the world to action. She crossed to the window, tried to wrench it open, found the frame stuck, blasted the latch, and discovered the drop too far. The angle wrong, the night full of invisible hazards, and her child pressed against her shoulder in nothing but pajamas and panic. Harry was crying now in earnest. "Hush," she said, though her own breath was breaking. "Hush, my darling, hush." The house settled after James's fall into an impossible silence. Footsteps on the stairs. Not hurried. Not angry. Merely certain. The lock buckled under one curse. The second shattered the door. Tom stood in the ruin with James's blood flecked darkly across one cuff. He had thrown back the hood. Lily saw absurdly that the years had left him less disfigured than rumor said and therefore more terrible. A creature with a snake's face could be hated at a distance. This was still a man. Still a man? And beautiful enough that ignorance might once have mistaken him for noble. "Stand aside," he said. His voice was low, almost weary, as if he were granting a convenience. Lily backed toward the cot. Harry clutched to her so tightly he squirmed. "No. The boy is all I have come for. No." There was no time in the room now except choice. Something flickered across Tom's face. Not pity, never that, but irritation touched by curiosity. "You may live. Move." Lily understood then. Not the depth of the bargain or who had purchased it, but enough. She was being offered survival as if it were a stain she could choose to carry. Step aside. Let the child die. Continue breathing in a world where breath would henceforth be accusation. She thought of James downstairs. Thought of Harry's hand fisted in her hair that morning. Thought of the thousand little futures only mothers learn to imagine in exhaustive, ridiculous detail. First words, first broken tooth. First broken tooth, first veille at school, muddy knees, fevers, birthday cakes gone wrong. The shape of his face at 15, at 20, at whatever age she herself would begin to see the man under the child. "No," she said again. Tom raised his wand. "Stand aside, girl." It might once have angered her that he spoke to her as if her name were beneath him. It did not matter. Names were for the living. No. Harry was screaming, terrified not by the words but by the weather of adults, by the palpable wrongness in the air. Lily lowered herself to her knees before the cot because standing no longer made sense. One arm curved around him. Her wand lay useless on the floor. She had dropped it without noticing. There were defensive spells she might have attempted, elaborate counter-curses, ward combinations taught in frantic order sessions by people running out of time to teach. None would be fast enough. None would be old enough. None would come from the place this came from. She did not think, "I will die for him." Thaw was too slow. She only knew that whatever passed through the room next would pass through her first if love could be made flesh enough to intercept a curse. For a fraction of a second, Tom hesitated. Later, had he lived to examine it, he might have said that what arrested him was not her refusal, but the quality of it. This was not heroism in the public sense he despised, not some bannered defiance meant to inspire witnesses. There were no witnesses. It was simply an absolute. A woman who had understood the terms and removed herself from them by denying the premise. A woman saying with her body, "Here, and no farther." He had never properly valued such things because they could not be recruited. They did not negotiate. They did not fear enough to be administered. The hesitation cost him nothing, he thought. He cast the curse. Green light filled the nursery. Not the thin beam of common dueling, not the ragged slash of anger, but a flood, a killing so total it seemed for one blinding instant to erase color itself. It struck Lily squarely as she bent over Harry. She died without falling away from him. The room changed. Not outwardly, not at first. The broken door still hung in splinters. The lamp still burned. Harry still screamed under his mother's collapsed body. Yet something older than technique, older than law, older perhaps than the division between magic and what existed before magic, moved through the space where Lily had given herself. Tom saw only fragments of it. A pressure, a sudden resistance where no shield had been cast. A heat not of flame but of contact with something incomprehensible and infuriatingly simple. Love, Dumbledore would later name it. And scholars would spend centuries humiliating themselves by trying to categorize what was in truth less a spell than a condition in which sacrifice altered the grammar of power. Tom had no name for it. He had only the instant knowledge that the room had ceased to obey him. Harry stared up at him, wet-cheeked and open-eyed above his mother's arm. Tom lifted his wand again. A child, he thought. An infant in a ruined crib. A final correction. Nothing more. The curse rebounded. There are deaths that occur as events and deaths that occur as revelations. This one was both. Green light struck the boy and found no purchase. It arced, wheeled, and came back through the room with a violence multiplied by refusal. Tom had one impossible heartbeat in which he understood not what love was, but what it was to be rejected by a force he had never admitted into his calculations. For the first time in years, perhaps in his life, he felt not merely threatened but mortal. No hidden anchor waited elsewhere. No maimed fragment of soul had been secreted into objects against this very contingency. He had never made such abominations. He had judged them beneath his sense of elegance, too crude in mutilation, too contemptible in their naked panic. He had believed mastery sufficient. Influence, terror, genius, caution, speed. Himself. Now all of himself was there to be broken. The curse hit him full in the chest. The house exploded. Windows burst outward. The roof above the nursery tore open with a shriek of timber and slate. Stone cracked. Plaster became a white storm. The lane outside lit for a second as if summer lightning had fallen directly into the cottage. Neighbors screamed. Somewhere a dog began barking and did not stop. When the dust settled, there was a hole where part of the upper story had been. In the wreckage of the nursery, among splintered wood and fallen plaster, Harry Potter lay crying with blood on his forehead where a shard had cut him in a jagged line above the brow. His mother was dead beside him. His father was dead below. And the man who had come to kill him was gone so completely that not even his shadow remained. Magic traveled faster than news, but not faster than grief. By the time Hagrid's boots pounded up the lane to the broken cottage, half the village had already seen the light and shut their curtains against it. Some had peered through cracks, whispering. Some had gathered in frightened clusters at the green, held back by the instinctive certainty that whatever had burst from the Potter's house was larger than ordinary accident. One woman cried openly and kept saying there'd been a baby in there. Another crossed herself as if old faiths could sort new horrors. Hagrid shouldered through them all like a ship through threads. "Out of the way," he barked, not loudly but with a force that made space open. His coat was barely buttoned. He had come at Dumbledore's summons without even a hat, hair and beard wild in the wind. "Let me through." The front of the house was split. The upper story gaped to the stars. Smoke and dust mingled in the night air with the sweet, wrong smell of burst magic, a scent like hot metal quenched in blood. Hagrid climbed over fallen stone and smashed doorframe, calling James' name once, Lily's once, though something in him already knew. He found James first, sprawled near the foot of the stairs, glasses broken under one hand. There were no marks on him except the stillness. Hagrid had seen Avada Kedavra kill before. It left very little to cling to, which was its obscenity. No wound to bind. No blood to account for the life gone missing. No, Hagrid said. Then he heard the crying overhead. He took the stairs 3 at a time despite the weight of him, despite the groaning timbers threatening to give. The nursery had ceased to be a room so much as a wound in the house. Moonlight poured in where the roof had been. Lily lay bent around the child even in death. Hagrid stopped dead, and his face crumpled with such naked force that later, no one who had known him only as large and cheerful could quite believe what grief did to him then. He knelt carefully, in rubble and splintered wood, and lifted Harry free. "All right, Liliune," he whispered, though his own voice had broken. "All right, I got ya. Harry clung instantly, not from recognition but from animal need. Blood streaked one side of his face. Hagrid looked wildly about for signs of the attacker and found none. No body. No wand. No dark figure sprawled in some corner. Only wreckage and an absence that rang. He had just managed to wrap Harry in the least dusty blanket he could find when someone came crashing through the hall below. "Sirius!" Hagrid roared, half in warning, half in hope. Sirius Black appeared at the ruin of the nursery door, white-faced and panting, his eyes too large in a face gone suddenly older than 21 had any right to be. He took in the room in one terrible sweep. James below, Lily on the floor, Hagrid with Harry in his arms, no enemy. For an instant, his whole body seemed to lose structure. He caught himself on the doorframe. "No," he said. Hagrid had never heard the word sound so much like something torn. Sirius crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside Lily, touching her shoulder as if she might wake if handled gently enough. The moment his fingers met the fabric of her robe, he stopped pretending, if he had been pretending at all. His face hardened into a kind of blankness, grief, sometimes used when it feared it would otherwise break the bones. "Harry?" he said. "He's alive," Hagrid said. "He's alive, Sirius." Sirius looked at the child and that blankness cracked. He laughed once, a sharp, unbelieving sound that was not mirth and not yet madness, only relief coming out at the wrong angle. "How?" Hagrid could only shake his head. Sirius rose abruptly. "Give him to me." Hagrid. In. The name came from below. Calm. Old. Irresistible. Dumbledore stood amid the broken hall with his cloak powdered white by plaster dust, Minerva McGonagall at his side in tartan dressing gown and overcoat, her hair pinned up as if even catastrophe should not find her unprepared. Dumbledore's eyes went first to James, then upward to Lily, then to Harry, and in that sequence Hagrid watched him accept more than one sorrow at once. "Take the child to his aunt and uncle," Dumbledore said. Sirius rounded on him. "What?" "Hagrid. I'm his godfather," Sirius said, and his voice was suddenly alive with anger because anger was easier to stand upright in than grief. "James and Lily would have wanted—" "I know what they would have wanted," Dumbledore said, and the quiet in it silenced the room. "But there are protections still to be placed, and time is not our ally." Sirius stared at him. Whatever he saw in Dumbledore's face ended the argument or postponed it past utility. He turned instead to Hagrid, reached into his pocket with shaking hands, and tossed him a set of keys that jingled absurdly in the wreck. "Take the bike," Sirius said. "It's faster." Hagrid hesitated. "What about ye?" Sirius' mouth twisted. "I've got something to do." Dumbledore's gaze sharpened. "Sirius." But Sirius was already gone, pounding back down the stairs and out into the night with the speed of a man who has at last understood the shape of betrayal and means to put his hands around its throat. Peter Pettigrew had not expected the village to be lit so far into the sky. He stood in a London street near a row of shuttered shops and realized, with the slow horror of someone catching up to his own choices, that Voldemort might truly be gone. Not hidden. Not transformed. Gone. The mark on his arm had burned and then gone cold in a way he had never felt before, not absent exactly, but emptied. Around him, distant shouts carried through the night as rumor scattered like sparks. He should run. He knew that. Run, vanish, take rat shape now and disappear into drains and walls and cellars before blame found a human outline to wear. Yet panic rarely proceeds by clean logic. It seeks witnesses. When Sirius found him, Peter had just enough time to arrange his face into wild, righteous terror. "You!" Sirius shouted. Passersby turned. A woman screamed and backed into a doorway. A lamplighter dropped his pole. Peter stumbled into the center of the street and pointed with a shaking hand. "Lily and James, Sirius. How could you?" The lie was so monstrous he almost choked on it. Sirius did not. He stopped as if struck. "What?" "You were their secret keeper." Sirius' expression emptied in exactly the way it had beside Lily's body. Then Peter saw the moment comprehension hit. Saw Sirius understand not merely that Peter had betrayed them, but that Peter meant to spend the last of this night turning the knife outward. That understanding should have made Sirius deadly. Instead, it made him too late. Peter screamed, "You killed them!" and blasted the street apart. The curse ripped through paving stones, gas line, and masonry in one white-orange bloom. The air went solid with dust and glass. People were thrown backward. The smell of burning brick rushed over everything. In the second before his own shockwave hit him, Peter severed his finger, left it behind like a punctuation mark, and transformed. The world altered scale. Boots became towers. A fallen hat became a collapsed tent. He scurried through rubble slicked with blood and soot, vanishing into a broken drain as voices rose above him in chaos. When Aurors arrived, they found 13 dead, a crater in the street, a severed finger, and Sirius Black standing in the middle of destruction, laughing with a sound so broken that half of them drew wands on instinct. By dawn, the story had fixed itself. At Hogwarts, Severus heard it from a first-year Hufflepuff, babbling to his roommates behind curtains. He had paused beside without meaning to listen. By breakfast, the Great Hall knew. By noon, every owl in Britain seemed to carry some version of the tale. Dark Lord gone. Potter's dead. Child survived. Sirius Black murdered innocents and betrayed his friends. Peter Pettigrew dead, a hero. Severus left the hall before pudding. He walked until he found himself on the covered bridge between two towers where the wind cut straight through stone. There he stood, gripping the balustrade so hard his knuckles went pale, and waited for the impossibility of Lily's death to resolve itself into dream or trick or some administrative error the ministry would shortly correct. Nothing changed. He heard robes behind him and knew before turning that it was Dumbledore. "She is dead," Dumbledore said. Severus made a small, raw sound and despised it instantly. "The child lives." That hurt too. Everything hurt, and the worst injury was not grief, but the knowledge that grief had hierarchy in him. Lily first, Harry second, James hardly at all except insofar as Lily had loved him. Dumbledore had seen that once already, and would see it now. There was no dignity left to preserve. "I asked you to save them," Severus said. Dumbledore's face was lined with a fatigue that looked older than age. "And I did all I could." "All you could?" Severus turned on him then, black robes lashing in the wind. "All you could." Dumbledore took the fury without flinching. "If you came for a target on which to spend your guilt, I suggest you begin with the man who carried the prophecy to Voldemort and proceed from there." Severus closed his eyes. When he opened them, Dumbledore was still there, patient as judgment. "He is gone," Dumbledore said quietly. "I do not mean fled. I mean gone. Whatever happened in that house ended him." Severus should have felt triumph. He felt only the hollowness left when vengeance arrives after usefulness. "What do you want of me now?" he asked. Dumbledore's answer came without pause. "Protect the boy. There is no Dark Lord left to return for him." "No," Dumbledore said. "But there are still his followers. There is still the world that made him possible. And there is still your debt. Debt, not redemption. Never that easy." Severus bowed his head into the wind because there was nothing else left to do. The days after a tyrant falls are full of people pretending they knew all along he could. Britain celebrated first in pockets, then in sheets. Fire whiskey appeared from cupboards that had not been opened in years. Spontaneous gatherings erupted in Diagon Alley, on village greens, in pub rooms suddenly willing to say the unsayable. Witches kissed strangers. Wizards wept into their sleeves and insisted they were laughing. Owls flew at all hours carrying contradictory reports enlarged by joy. Whole families emerged from hiding to test whether the sky really had changed. It had, and it had not. Barty Crouch Sr. moved through the ministry like a blade at last given permission to cut. Raids were authorized. Safe houses stormed. Names long protected by bribery or bloodline found their thresholds crowded with Aurors at dawn. Some Death Eaters fought. Some fled. Some, more interestingly, discovered entire philosophies of responsibility that left them with no meaningful relation to their own deeds. The imperious defense blossomed overnight among old money like a winter fungus. Lucius Malfoy appeared before the Wizengamot in immaculate morning black, his voice low with dignified outrage at what dark coercion had supposedly compelled him to do. Half the chamber wanted his head. The other half wanted his invitation list. He survived because evidence in wartime is rarely as neat as justice desires, and because respectability, once lacquered over corruption, reflects enough light to blind weak institutions. Bellatrix Lestrange did not bother with respectability. She spat at interrogators, laughed at sentences, and demanded audience after audience to insist that the Dark Lord had not died, could not have died, must be hidden, trapped, transformed, waiting. Her certainty infected others. Fanatics require very little material from which to build hope. It was in pursuit of that hope that Bellatrix, her husband Rodolphus, her brother-in-law Rabaston, and Barty Crouch Jr. found Frank and Alice Longbottom. The attack took place in a safe house near the coast under wards Frank himself had helped devise. That they were breached at all proved how deep old knowledge still ran through the surviving networks. Orders arrived too late. Neighbors remembered screams that went on long enough to become unreal. The Longbottoms survived in the technical sense. When Dumbledore visited St. Mungo's afterward, Alice Longbottom stared at the wall with both hands folded in her lap and did not blink for nearly a minute at a time. Frank attempted, with harrowing politeness, to offer Dumbledore a chair in a room where there was no second chair, and had to be gently convinced there was no meeting in progress. "They were looking for him," said the healer in a voice scraped hollow by repetition. "They thought the Longbottoms knew where he'd gone. But there was nowhere to go." Dumbledore knew that now, with a certainty he would not yet have called theoretical, and did not need to. He had stood in the ruin at Godric's Hollow and felt the residue there. Not displacement, not concealment, an ending. Something in the rebound had not merely unseated Voldemort. It had annihilated the body and sent the soul where souls went when they had not taken obscene precautions against justice. Dumbledore would later, in more private years, revisit that conclusion with subtler tools and still find no reason to doubt it. The war, however, did not understand endings. Wars prefer aftershocks. Severus moved through those weeks with the muted precision of a man preserving function by narrowing it. He taught. He brewed. He attended staff meals and barely tasted them. At Dumbledore's request, he began carefully to note which surviving families sought to reconnect, which names appeared in letters, which old associates vanished too efficiently. There was no Dark Lord to spy upon, but there were still webs to map. If service could not restore Lily, it could at least deny comfort to some of those who had helped kill her. Minerva McGonagall watched him with open distrust the first time he delivered a report. "You expect me to believe him useful?" she said after he had gone. Dumbledore, seated by the fire in his office, did not answer immediately. Fawkes rustled on his perch. "I expect you," Dumbledore said at last, "to believe that damaged instruments may still play the music required of them." Minerva snorted. "That is a remarkably romantic way to describe a man you privately know to be morally repellent." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled, but there was no mirth in it. "My dear Minerva, I assure you I have no illusions at all. It was on the 1st of November, before the Lestrange trial, before Frank and Alice, before the Ministry had even settled on how loudly to celebrate, that Dumbledore brought Harry to Privet Drive. The night was brittle with cold. Frost had silvered the clipped suburban hedges. The neat houses of Privet Drive sat under the dark with their identical windows and disciplined lawns, each one so furiously ordinary it almost took effort not to laugh. Minerva, already waiting in animagus form and now restored to tartan and severity, stood beside the low wall with her arms folded. "I've watched them all day," she said. "These are the worst sort of muggles." Dumbledore glanced up at number 4, where no light burned in the nursery room that one day would not be a nursery. "They are not an appealing pair. That child is famous already. He is also safer here than in any drawing room of adoring fools." Hagrid arrived on Sirius' motorbike in a gust of engine roar and cold air, the machine settling with a protesting shudder beneath his weight. Harry was asleep in his arms, Exhausted at last after 2 days of strange faces, too much movement, too many voices thick with grief, leaning over him and saying his name as if repetition could substitute for protection. Hagrid passed him over with a tenderness that transformed his enormous hands into something almost priestly. "Poor little bloke," he muttered. Dumbledore tucked the blanket more securely around Harry and looked down at the scar, dark and fresh under the lamplight. It was not, he thought, any ordinary wound. But neither was it a mark of possession. There was no sense of intrusion about the child, no echo from the ruin. Only the afterprint of violence and the old magic of a mother's choice lingering like shielded fire. "He should not grow up in his fame," Minerva said. "No. Then why leave him with people who will despise the part of him that matters?" Dumbledore's expression changed, and for a second the old sorrow in him showed plain. "Because blood can still protect where affection fails. Because Petunia Dursley is Lily's sister, whether she values that or not. Because there are enchantments founded in kinship that can buy him years I do not know how else to secure." He laid Harry on the step as gently as if setting down a glass instrument. The baby stirred, made a soft protesting noise, and slept on. The letter Dumbledore tucked into the blankets was several pages longer than any man in that street deserved to read. When it was done, they stood for a moment in silence. "Will he be all right?" Hagrid asked. Dumbledore looked at the sleeping child, then at the dark street, then at the stars above a world briefly rid of its greatest immediate terror, and not at all rid of itself. "No," he said softly, "but he will live." 10 years passed in 2 directions at once. In public memory, the war contracted into anecdotes tidy enough for children. Bonfire night jokes were made about the night you-know-who blew himself up. Brave men acquired cleaner histories than truth allowed. Cowards acquired better excuses. Mothers who had hidden in cellars through air made dangerous by magic listened to younger people speak of those years, as if fear had been dramatic rather than boring and relentless. The dead were memorialized in marble and charity drives and annual moments of silence, brief enough not to inconvenience anyone. In private, the damage persisted. Sirius Black rotted in Azkaban, clinging to the knowledge that Peter lives because knowledge was the only thing the Dementors could not quite suck clean if one sharpened it into hatred first. Remus Lupin drifted from temporary job to temporary room, carrying poverty as if it were another old bite wound that flared with weather. Snape stood at the front of a dungeon classroom year after year and turned sarcasm into a discipline because kindness would have felt like theft from the dead. Dumbledore smiled, schemed, taught, and watched the old alliances of blood and ambition reseal themselves under peacetime varnish. And at number 4, Privet Drive, Harry grew. Harry's childhood was a long education in unwantedness, punctuated by inexplicable wonders. He learned early that cupboard air had a particular smell in summer: dust, old shoes, and the sweet stale breath of stored blankets. He learned that Aunt Petunia's mouth tightened into a white line whenever letters arrived addressed to him in green ink. He learned that Uncle Vernon disliked questions, oddness, and the possibility that the world contained any categories not already catalogued by sales charts and drills. He learned that Dudley's gang could outrun him on flat ground, but not through alleys, hedges, or places where quickness mattered more than size. He learned, too, that his own anger sometimes had curious effects. Hair grew back overnight after disastrous cuts. Teachers' chalk snapped in their hands when they accused him falsely. A teacher's ugly jumper shrank 2 sizes on sports day, while Harry watched from the back of the line and tried not to smile. The famous scar on his forehead became, in the Muggle world, merely an old injury. In the Wizarding world, it became symbol before he knew the word for symbol. No voice hissed through it in dreams. No alien temper flooded him by way of a wound. What haunted Harry instead were fragments too human to be supernatural. The vague impression of green light, the certainty that once someone had been screaming not in terror for herself but for him, and the smell of smoke mingled with milk. On his 11th birthday, Hagrid brought the world back. He came not through fire or thunder, but through the broken door of the sea hut, where the Dursleys had fled the owls, taking up the whole doorway in a coat that smelled of rain and wild places. The cake was slightly squashed. The information was not. "A wizard," Hagrid said, as if the matter had only now become undeniable. "You're a wizard, Harry." Something in Harry, long mocked and starved and shoved under stairs, sat up at those words as if hearing its own name for the first time. The next day, Diagon Alley received him like a story returning to circulation. He was stared at. That was the first and least comfortable fact. People stopped mid-sentence in shop doors. A witch buying cauldrons put both hands over her mouth and began to cry. An old wizard in a plum coat shook Harry's hand 3 times in succession and forgot to tell him his name. Faces leaned toward the scar, and then, to Harry's increasing confusion, looked away again with an expression not of morbid curiosity, but reverence shaded by relief. He was not yet skilled enough to understand that they were not only seeing the boy, they were seeing the night fear lost its monopoly. At Ollivander's, amid the smell of dust and varnished wood, another piece of the past waited. Mr. Ollivander held Harry's wand between long pale fingers and smiled his unsettling smile. "Holly and phoenix feather," he murmured. 11 inches, nice and supple, an unusual combination for unusual circumstances. Harry, who had just sent a cascade of red and gold sparks through the dim shop at the wand's first touch, stared. The wand felt not new but recognized, as if a sentence begun elsewhere had found its grammar in his hand. "There's another wand," Ollivander said, almost to himself, "with a feather from the same phoenix. Brothers, one might say. Very curious indeed." "What happened to it?" Harry asked. Something old and unreadable crossed Ollivander's eyes. "It performed terrible magic," he said. "And then, perhaps, it met its reckoning." He did not elaborate. Harry was grateful. In Madame Malkin's he met a pale boy, with sleek hair and sharp, appraising eyes, who spoke of bloodlines and broomsticks, and the unsuitability of some families, with the complacent confidence of a child. Harry disliked him immediately without understanding why. There was something about the drawl, the assumption of instant hierarchy, that made his skin prickle. On the train to Hogwarts, the same boy found him again and introduced himself properly as Draco Malfoy. By then, Harry had met Ron Weasley, who was all elbows and freckles and shy indignation in the face of his own poverty, and Hermione Granger, whose intelligence arrived in a rush so forceful it resembled weather. The 3 of them had not yet become inseparable, but something had already leaned in that direction. Harry's gratitude at being liked for himself rather than his legend, Ron's astonished delight that the famous boy would share a compartment, suites without condescension, Hermione's refusal to let either of them remain ignorantly dramatic when correction was available. Draco stood in the compartment doorway with Crabbe and Goyle hulking behind him, and offered Harry friendship as if offering a diplomatic correction to a regrettable social error. "You'll soon find some wizarding families are better than others," Draco said. "You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort." Ron's ears went pink. Harry felt heat stir in him before thought. "I think I can tell who the wrong sort are for myself," he said. It was not the grandest rebuff in literary history. It did the job. After Draco had gone, Ron stared. "Blame me?" Hermione, arranging her books by size for no reason except perhaps that order pleased her, said, "He seems dreadful." "Yeah," Harry said. Then, after a moment, he laughed. The castle that received them at Journey's End had loomed in stories all Harry's life without him knowing it. Lit against the dark towers rising above the black water, it seemed less like a building than a verdict in stone. Hagrid herded the first years down the path and into boats. Water slapped wood. Lantern lights shook gold across faces too young yet to understand how much of their future was already reflected back at them by that ancient school. Inside the entrance hall, Professor McGonagall stood rigid as a spear in emerald robes, and informed them that the sorting into houses was a solemn ceremony of great significance. Neville Longbottom, round-faced and anxious, dropped his toad before they even reached the doors. Hermione immediately tried to help find it. Ron muttered that this was a nightmare. Harry absurdly felt as though his whole life had narrowed to one corridor and whatever lay at the end. The great hall dazzled him. Candles floated in the air. The ceiling held the night. Hundreds of faces turned toward the first years, and Harry understood with fresh dismay that even here, where everyone wore black robes and fear ought to be democratically distributed, he was known. Whispers moved like ripples. The boy who lived. Harry Potter. Look, there. At the staff table, Snape's eyes caught his for the first time. The sensation was so sharp Harry nearly looked away at once. The professor's face was pale and severe, his black hair framing a gaze that seemed to take inventory by instinct and find the world habitually lacking. Yet in that single fixed look, there was something stranger than dislike. Recognition, yes. Also pain. Also, to Harry's later amazement, something like alarm swiftly hidden. Dumbledore sat at the center in robes of deep plum, older than any grandfather and somehow more alive than most young men. When his gaze rested on Harry, it carried no proprietary satisfaction, none of the hunger for symbolic fulfillment Harry would later learn public figures often directed at useful children. It was kind, certainly, but more than kind. It was careful, as if Dumbledore saw not only the famous survivor, but the cost of being seen as such. The Sorting Hat shouted, "Gryffindor!" over Harry's head, and the table on the left erupted. Ron joined him moments later, flushed with relief. Hermione came after and looked as if she meant to prove the hat correct by force if necessary. Draco went to Slytherin with an expression of vindicated entitlement. Neville, shaking, ended in Gryffindor too, to his own obvious surprise. The feast arrived in golden platters and vanished in equal splendor. Ghosts drifted between tables. Percy Weasley corrected people. Seamus Finnegan set his eyebrows slightly singed within the first hour. Everything was absurd and glorious, and so saturated with possibility that Harry, half the time, forgot to be overwhelmed. Yet beneath the feast ran older currents. At the Slytherin table, older students leaned together under low voices and glanced sometimes toward Muggle-born names on the parchment lists with expressions their parents would have recognized. At the staff table, Snape spoke little and watched much. Quirrell. Now the defense against the dark arts professor trembled over his goblet as if every candle flame personally threatened him. Professor Binns, the ghost who taught history of magic, drifted through dinner with the absent-minded certainty of a bureaucracy too old to realize it was dead. Later, in the common room, older Gryffindors told stories of the last war simplified to the point of usefulness. Voldemort had risen. Good people had fought him. Harry had survived. The end. It sounded cleaner than war ever was. Harry listened from an armchair too deep for him and wondered what parts had been left out, because even children could hear the blank spaces when adults arranged memory too neatly. That night, long after the others had gone up, Dumbledore stood alone in his office with a lemon drop melting slowly on its saucer, and looked into the fire. Severus came when summoned. "He has no trace of him," Dumbledore said without preamble. Severus's mouth tightened. "I did not expect otherwise." "No," said Dumbledore. "You expected James in the face and Lily in the eyes, and resented both." Severus said nothing. Dumbledore took the silence for confirmation, as he had likely intended. "The child is only himself," Dumbledore went on. "That is a mercy not everyone receives from history. And the world will make use of that mercy until it ruins him," Severus said. "Already they stare." Dumbledore sighed. "Then we must teach him to survive being seen." "Teach him?" Severus's lip curled. "You heard the hat. He has landed with the lions. They do not teach. They applaud." "Sometimes," Dumbledore said. "They do both." Below them the castle settled around sleeping children. Harry, in the tower room beneath a small round window, lay in a bed curtained deep red and listened to Neville's soft snoring and Dean Thomas murmuring in dreams. The scar on his forehead did not burn. No dark mind opened through it. But when at last sleep took him, he dreamed of a ruined nursery under the stars, and a woman whose face he could not quite see bending over him with all the force in the world, gathered into the simple shape of protectiveness. He woke before dawn with tears on his face and no idea why. Morning at Hogwarts began in drafts and bells. Harry woke to light the color of watered silver and the impression, so strong it almost counted as memory, that someone had once died very close to him in order that he might continue breathing. He lay still for a moment, listening to the castle, pipes muttering, feet somewhere overhead, a door opening and closing far down the corridor, pigeons or owls clattering at the roofline. He had imagined magic as noise, brilliance, continual astonishment. There was plenty of that, certainly. Yet what struck him most that first morning was how lived-in enchantment sounded. The castle did not sing of mystery. It groaned, rattled, warmed, sighed. Magic here had become architecture. Ron woke all at once and nearly fell out of bed, reaching for his glasses. "What time is it?" "Morning," Harry said. "Helpful," Ron muttered. Neville, still half asleep, sat up with his hair flattened on one side and asked in real alarm whether they had missed herbology. Dean laughed into his pillow. Seamus set his bed curtains on fire with an incautious spell while trying to summon his socks. Harry discovered that he loved them all a little already for the sheer disorder of their existence. At breakfast, the great hall looked less theatrical and more itself. Sunlight replaced candlelight. The enchanted ceiling held a clean autumn blue. Owls plunged from above with letters, parcels, and one hideous shriek when an eagle owl overshot Percy Weasley's shoulder and had to bank awkwardly around a suit of armor. Harry had barely begun his porridge when the post brought him his first look at attention weaponized. A dozen owls descended in untidy sequins, carrying notes from people he did not know. Second cousins of old wizarding lions inviting him to tea. The widow of a man who had died in the war offering him a scarf she said his mother once admired, a journalist fishing by flattery, a broom shop promising a discount if he would only be seen exiting their door. Ron stared. "Blimey," he said again, because for Ron, blimey covered a multitude of realities. Hermione, already halfway through her timetable and visibly delighted by the complexity of staircases, peered over a stack of toast. "You don't have to answer them." Harry looked at the pile. "Can I set them on fire?" "Not in the hall," she said. Draco Malfoy, 2 tables away, watched with narrowed eyes. It was not merely dislike in that expression. It was calculation learned young. Harry knew the look without having a name for it because Uncle Vernon wore a cruder version when measuring salesmen, neighbors, or anyone whose existence threatened his ranking system. Draco had been taught since infancy that the world was a lattice of position. Fame without the right pedigree must look to him like theft. Lessons began. Charms glittered and misfired. Transfiguration required an attention to detail that made Ron despair and Hermione nearly incandescent with pleasure. Herbology smelled of wet earth and leaf mold and immediate injury. History of magic consisted of Professor Binns droning through goblin rebellions, while the ghosts of actual grievances hovered unaddressed at the edges of every paragraph. It was in history that Harry first heard his own story told as institutional memory. Binns, drifting a foot above the floor, reached the late 20th century only because Hermione asked whether modern magical governance had been altered by the recent conflict. At once the class sharpened. Even Draco looked up. The disturbances of the 1970s and early 1980s, Binns said in the tone one might use for mold outbreaks in medieval grain stores, represented a period of regrettable instability driven by extremist blood purity ideology, under the wizard styling himself Lord Voldemort. This movement was eventually suppressed following the disappearance of its leader in 1981. Harry waited. That was all. No names of the dead. No mention of what it had felt like to live then. No explanation of how ordinary prejudice had ripened into murder under ministry noses. No accounting of why some families filled half the Waisengamat while others filled the memorial plaques. Just extremist ideology, instability, disappearance. History sanded down until no present person need feel implicated by it. Hermione's hand shot up. Professor, how did he gain so much support if the ideology was so extreme? Binns blinked as if someone had asked why Mildew preferred bread to granite. Long-standing social biases, Miss Granger. Certain grievances. Some institutional weakness. Which biases? Hermione pressed. Which institutions? Binns peered at her through the fog of his own afterlife. Oh, quite complicated. Draco smirked. Harry looked at him, then around the classroom, at the sons and daughters of old names and muggle dentists and shopkeepers and farmers, at Neville Longbottom chewing his quill in distracted anxiety, at the patch of empty desk where some future student might one day sit under the false assumption that history had happened cleanly before their birth. Something hot and uncertain moved in Harry. Not anger exactly, or not only that. A desire to prise open the tidy lid on things. After class, in the corridor, Hermione was still fuming. "He skipped the whole thing," she said. "You could have replaced the lesson with a paragraph in a bad pamphlet." Ron shrugged. "History's always like that. Dad says Binns thinks the last interesting event was 1700 and something." "That isn't an answer." "It kind of is, actually." Harry smiled despite himself. Then he glanced back down the corridor where Draco had paused under a tapestry to speak with two older Slytherins. The older boys leaned down to him with the conspiratorial ease of those recognizing one another by inherited vocabulary. When Draco noticed Harry looking, he smiled a thin smile and said something that made them all laugh. "What?" Ron demanded. Harry shook his head. "Nothing. Just nothing." But it was not nothing. It was the old poison Dumbledore had feared and named and fought, now diluted, perfumed, denied, but alive. Voldemort's death had broken a man, not the habits that made men like him legible to their followers. Harry did not yet possess the language to think that through. He only knew the castle was full of ghosts who had not died and corridors where stories traveled with pieces deliberately missing. That evening, as the first years climbed toward Gryffindor Tower under portraits muttering passwords in their sleep, Professor McGonagall stopped Harry in the landing outside a high window. "Mr. Potter." He turned at once. "Yes, Professor." For a moment, she seemed to have forgotten why she had called him. The torchlight caught the strong bones of her face and made her look almost stern enough to crack. "You bear resemblance," she said finally, "to both your parents. It would be easy for foolish people to tell you what that means. Do not let them." Harry stared. "I'm sorry?" A faint, dry softness touched her mouth. "I mean that you are not obligated to repeat either of them in order to honor them." He had not known until that moment that he needed the permission. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and swept on. Above them, in the headmaster's office, Dumbledore poured tea for Severus and for himself. Fawkes preened one ruby wing. The room smelled of old paper, lemon peel, and wood smoke. "You have been watching Draco Malfoy," Dumbledore observed. Severus stirred nothing into his tea. "I watch all Slytherins, some more tenderly than others. There is nothing tender in my attention." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled at that, then sobered. "Lucius will shape the boy if given full scope. Ambition, grievance, elegance, entitlement. A familiar recipe." "And the Potter boy?" Severus asked, the words edged by an old bitterness worn now to something more complex. "What recipe shapes him?" Dumbledore looked into his cup as though the answer might be steeping there. "Neglect," he said. "Survival. Unexpected friendships. The absence, perhaps, of a darkness that might have spoken in him if Tom had chosen another road in life." Woman. Severus's gaze flicked up. "You still think on what he did not do." "Often," Dumbledore said. "It matters. There are men who fear death so much they will mutilate the very essence of themselves to avoid it. Tom did not cross that boundary. Pride prevented one obscenity and delivered him to another. He kept his soul whole enough to lose it all at once. Severus made a small, contemptuous noise. That almost sounds like praise. No, Dumbledore said. Only taxonomy. They drank in silence for a while. Below, in the common room, Ron played wizard chess with Seamus and lost a knight through overconfidence. Hermione read ahead by the fire, occasionally glancing up to tell them they were all moving their bishops incorrectly. Neville searched under a sofa for Trevor. Harry sat in an armchair with a library book open on his knees, and found that every few pages he lifted his head to look around as if still half unbelieving that rooms could be safe enough for idleness. He was not happy in the simple fairy tale way adults assign to rescued children. Happiness had to learn the shape of him. But something steadier than happiness had begun, belonging not granted by fame but built in moments so small they almost escaped notice. A shared chocolate frog. A joke understood. A correction offered without cruelty. A staircase navigated together. The first discovery that one's name, spoken by friends, might refer not to legend but to presence. When the others finally climbed to bed, Harry lingered by the window. The grounds lay under moonlight, lawns silvered, lake black and still. The forbidden forest a dark thought at the edge of everything civilized. Somewhere out there foxes moved, and centaurs perhaps, and histories older than the school. Somewhere beyond the hills lay Godric's Hollow, though he could not have pointed to it. Somewhere farther still, in prison and poverty and polished manor houses, the last consequences of a dead man's choices went on rearranging the living. Harry touched the scar on his forehead. It did not hurt. He did not know that this was mercy. He did not know how different his life might have been had another will burned behind that mark, whispering, intruding, turning even his private thoughts into contested territory. He knew only that the skin there was slightly raised beneath his fingertips, and that sometimes, when he tried very hard, he could almost feel the memory of a hand never laid upon him because it had laid itself between him and death instead. He went to bed and slept. In the office above, Dumbledore stood long after Severus had gone and watched the castle through the tall, dark windows. He thought of a prophecy spoken in a filthy room, of a mother kneeling in a nursery, of a brilliant young man who had believed himself too disciplined for the crude panic of soul-splitting, and had therefore met death with nothing between it and him but arrogance. He thought of history, which never ended so tidily as the grateful preferred, and of children beginning school under burdens they could not yet name. At last he put out the lamps. The castle sank deeper into night. And in that night, for the first time in many years, no hidden shard of Voldemort waited anywhere in the world to wake.